Hello and welcome to this very special episode of How to Be a Great GM. Well, I am joined obviously by two GMs that I very much respect, and that's in the form of Simon from Germany. Hello, Simon.
Hello.
And Mike from the USA. Hello, Mike.
Hello.
All right, and I have brought these two wonderful people together at the suggestion of Simon at the debate that we've been having in the show The Adventures of the Windswift, which airs on the sister channel Bacon RPG every week. You can go and watch Simon try and struggle through one of my campaigns, and a question was raised then around plot armor. Now, plot armor, very, very quickly from my perspective, is where the GM uses their narrative power, uses their ability to adjust and change values on the fly to protect the party members from decisions that the characters or the players have made on their behalf that may or may not have ended up in them dying or in the campaign ending prematurely because everyone has gone in different directions. So plot armor is a way of keeping the game going, even though the dice might have suggested otherwise. That's my personal take. Simon, what do you think is plot armor? Let's define that quickly.
It's bad.
Okay, so do you agree, though, in terms of it being that's what it is? It's the GM manipulating the story to save the players.
Well, plot armor can be many things, and I, in the case I'm going to do in a little bit, which I think everybody has somewhat prepared, so it's cohesive. I'll define plot armor, but I can say it right now, which is, I say it's a tangible protection of the player characters from negative consequences because of circumstances of their choices.
Aha, absolutely perfect. Mike, would you agree with that?
The only thing that I think I would add to that definition would be that it's not just for the PCs. As GMs, we could give plot armor to the villains as well. If it's not the villain's time in the story to die, and we protect the villains from the PCs.
Oh, there we go. That's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so of course we're now going to run through not so much of a debate as a discussion on whether or not you approve, whether you use, whether you don't use plot armor. And we're going to unpack this so that you at home can sit there and watch and think, well, I agree with that, or I agree with that, or I'm going to use this this definition, or I'm going to use this, or I'm going to use that for your game at home. Now, of course, if you disagree, or if you feel that we've left something out, or that we haven't discussed something, or we missed the point completely, that's what the comments are for. Please, 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 let's start this discussion, because this is a very interesting space and it touches on a lot of subjects which people get very, very sensitive about. So I think let's kick this off, and what we're going to do is I'm going to just roll a dice here to see who gets to go first, and that would be me. I get to go first because it's my show. So in terms of what I think plot armor is all about, my argument is plot armor has to happen. And the reason for it is that the idea that using a dice, a random number generator, so it doesn't matter what system you're using, but the fact that you're using a random number generator to determine the outcome of situations means that there is a very good opportunity for those random numbers to stack in a certain direction which completely derails the narrative. Now, how important is the narrative? Well, obviously, you're watching my channel, you'll know the narrative for me is almost all important. And this debate, this discussion that we've been having offline, because I've also been speaking to you guys on Twitter and on the Facebook account, has started to make me question that as to, do I hold it up to too much of this vaunted status of the narrative is paramount? At the moment, however, I believe that narrative is the most important. So if a random number is going to determine the fact that my story comes to a grinding halt, or that, as Mike has rightly added to the debate, the villain is suddenly taken out of the picture way too early, I don't have an issue with the GM stepping in and using a narrative construct to not ignore the results of the dice, but to change the scenario so that the dice results are not the termination of a character or an NPC. Now, I absolutely do not advocate that this should be done in a way that you have paratrooping dwarves who suddenly miraculously appear in the middle of a dungeon and rescue everybody. That's a very obvious, a very poor narrative choice. I advocate that you have a lot of things that you've set up beforehand that allow you to pull on those to make it a little bit more logical. Now, the reason why that I think that this is okay is because you as the GM are creating these stories. You determine that there is a tribe of orcs that live nearby the city because that's the plot that you've come up with. You've determined that those orcs are there when the when the player characters arrive. You've determined that the orcs are going to act in a hostile way. In other words, you have predominantly made choices for the NPCs that have very little to do with dice rolls. Now, if you're doing random encounters, that's one way of looking at it, for sure. But again, you've determined how those characters behave and act. So just because the dice say that the characters have overpowered the party and should now consume and eat the party, you as the game master can step in and have them decide not to, and turn that into a narrative. So for me, plot armor is a very valuable tool that you can add to your arsenal to keep your game running, but at the same time to make sure that it doesn't derail. So that's my take on plot armor. That's how I feel plot armor works. So now we're going to throw it open. Simon and Mike, what can you say about what I say? Where do you disagree? Without going into yours, because I'm going to give you guys both an option to discuss your points of view as well.
So my question would be, if you are opposed to the outcome of a dice roll, because you have envisioned the story going certain places, because you have laid out the story in a certain way, why... okay, I'm just going to say it how I thought about it. Why don't you write a book? What I mean by it, what's the benefit on playing a role-playing game if you have an end in mind?
Right, absolutely. It's a very good question. The reason why I think it actually is a book, but it's not written exclusively by myself. So it's a collaborative storytelling. That's how I see it. So the players are joining the table to explore and unfold and tell the story. I'm modifying the bigger story that I want to tell based on the players' actions, based on their choices, based on their character backstories. So I'm saying you take what you're given, you take what you'd planned, and you work them together to create this emergent story. And I don't want this to necessarily derail an emergent story. Now, as an example, if you look at Game of Thrones, to me it feels very much like that book, the series of books. It almost feels like the player characters were being killed off by the dice, because there'd be a character that you liked and then suddenly they would die. And you'd go, well, I feel disconnected from the show, or I feel this, or I feel that, or I feel the next thing. True, ultimately it made the show a lot more... it became like the show's thing, right? Where people die off all the time, so it's like, who's going to die in this season? And everyone kind of waits for that to happen. Does that make it a worse story? No, it doesn't. But that becomes the intention. So we don't build any loyalty to those characters because, they're probably going to die this episode. So
I think the advantage that Game of Thrones has, that it has a lot more characters than just your usual game, right? So if you have 5 player characters, obviously if one misses, then it's a bigger hit than if you have Game of Thrones with like 20 or whatever odd characters.
Correct. Mike, any questions from you on my positioning?
Well, you just mentioned Game of Thrones, and when you asked me to talk about plot armor, I got to really thinking about what is the opposite of plot armor, and that would be George R.R. Martin for sure. You know, he is the antithesis of plot armor.
He's plot vindictiveness, isn't he? Absolutely. Okay, so I think unless Simon, you have any other questions on my position?
Sure. Okay,
Sure,
so
I do.
here's
That's my list.
absolutely. Give me a second here. No. So the from taking directly from our game. Why I brought it up is because something like this had happened in our game recently, and there were no power dropping dwarves, so that's not what happened. Obviously, this is a very extreme example. But what I felt like is the decisions didn't have consequences, which is something I will go into more detail later on. So here is why I think it is why I defined my plot armor the way I did, because keeping them from consequences. What I don't mean is like just death. Death isn't the only consequence that can happen, and if you nearly die, there might be some scars that you can get along the way, and that is something that I found missing, and that's why I brought it up, because there didn't seem to be any repercussion.
Right, absolutely.
So my question then with this side note is, what's the difference between the absolute not needing to die and the keeping everything in pristine order, I guess.
Right. Yes. That chaos. It's a very good question, and as you ask it, I'm going, well, you are right. That is an area where there is a quite a big potential for it to not happen. I think the question that one then needs to answer your question with is, when there's a consequence, be it a scar or a lost limb, if it's for narrative, if it makes the story cooler that the character has this disfiguring scar that reduces their statistics, so it impacts the mechanics.
Sure.
Which I know sounds like a little bit of a contradiction in terms. We change the mechanics, and yet my whole argument is to almost ignore the mechanics. If there is a narrative reason for it, then it makes sense. To me, the consequence might be later on down the line, I save it as a plot device for use later. So if the characters get out of a scrape and there isn't a immediate form of satisfaction because of that getting out of that scrape, how they got out of it might come back 6 months later in playing time, that thing or that object now requires to be repaid, etc., etc. So I bank it away as an additional tool I can use later on to then get the players to go in a specific direction that I want to go it in. But again, I mean that's it boils down to, as you say, the story versus consequence, and how do you handle that. Right. And maybe I don't have a satisfactory answer on that. Maybe for me, story is too important. And that's what I loved about that question that was asked, is that it has got me to sit back and go, well, sure, what are the consequences? What are the outcomes? So I'm going to read to you quickly what was said on the YouTube channel. I've just got, I think it's an important little comment here, and we were talking sort of Game of Thrones and that kind of stuff. So Michael Helvenstein, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, wrote, "That brings me to the point about plot armor. As I've mentioned in past comments, for example, just as Mutaru jumped to certain doom to retrieve his Naginata, that was an event in an earlier show, we've pretty much already crossed that bridge, plot armor bridge. I fully expect Guy to protect and resurrect his players' characters as long as the story is interesting and entertaining. But that's all right, because the story is interesting and entertaining. I know we're dealing with a DM who can handle every situation in a narratively satisfying way, and players will not take advantage, both demonstrated in this very episode. I consume plenty of fiction where I know the protagonist won't die, but that doesn't make me appreciate the story any less." Now, obviously, that's one of the comments that supports what I'm trying to do. And I think it does, though, raise the specter that if the GM is not experienced with balancing that in terms of how to weave that in, it can become very bad. All right, so just one more comment here from
So
Rob.
if I may interject here,
Yes.
because he actually brought up the last thing that I wanted to ask you is
Right.
the abuse of plot armor.
Right.
So simple psychology is we want to win. It's just like we like succeeding in whatever we do, right? And partially this also comes down to role playing. Obviously, you have players who are almost addicted to it, and you have some who are more okay with embracing failure. But if you give the players the feeling that there are no consequences to their foolishness, let's put it into like very extreme terms so it becomes abundantly clear, then I think it is impossible that you won't act upon this metagaming knowledge. So what do you do to mitigate this, if at all?
Right. No, you're absolutely correct. And the bottom line is, from my sake, what I do if my players start to take advantage of the fact that they can't die, well, generally speaking, I get bored and then I'll stop the story because it means that they're taking advantage. So, and that comes back to me saying that this is a collaboration event. We're getting together to tell a story. So if there's a person there who's telling the story in a way that they want to say it, but that's foolish or, as you say, taking advantage of the situation, that's not something that I want to personally play with. So my solution there is to actually just to stop the game and try something else. So that is absolutely a major issue. Whereas if everyone's not on the same page, you are going to get that happening. And I have had it in my games where people have either tried to really write the rules lawyer book and correct those kinds of things, and I've also had it where people go, well, he can't kill me, so I'm going to try and do this and do that, and they take it to extremes. So yes, my only solution there is to literally say, all right, well, that's enough of this game, let's try something else, and then I'll usually find a different player. It's a very poor answer, I know, it's not very helpful. But
I actually talked about this with my son who was in the game with you, Guy, the wizard that wouldn't shut up. We were talking about plot armor, and I flat out asked him, from a player perspective, what would you think as a player if you knew that the GM just saved your character? And he said that personally, as a player, he would look at it as, I'm an idiot. I need to be more careful. I need to buy better armor. I need to pay better attention during the game. And so for him anyway, this would be more of a learning experience so that he could become a better role player down the road. I do see that certain players would take advantage of that situation, and during their watch in the night, they're going to run off into the orc camp by themselves because, hey, I can't die. Bring it on. Let's go. But there's two sides of it. And I think it just boils down to knowing your players and how you think they would react. So that's kind of my input on Guy's answer to that. I think that there's a couple different ways as a player you could look at it, not just from a GM standpoint.
That's fantastic. Absolutely, I agree with you. And I mean, of all the people to have said that, yes, your son received the full brunt of here's a stranger arriving in his game, and he and I had an absolutely wonderful repartee between the two of us, with basically my character telling him to shut up every single five seconds or so. But he I hope he knew that was the character and not the player.
You got a kick out of it.
Right, absolutely. So to wrap off perhaps my side of things, Rob Davis writes, perhaps a bit at level 1. This is talking about plot armor, of course. Or for the first half of the first session. After that, PC death is on the table, and I never have plots contingent on the survival of a PC. So that's what Rob Davis suggests. That's what he says. Keenage Tenson, or Kenage Tenson, I'm not sure, says, current plot of mine, if they all die, I move the age of the world up, and we start the new campaign dealing with the results of their failure. The plot moves on with or without the PCs, which they are already learning the hard way as they have to make the hard choices. So that's two different sort of objectives, two different thoughts. Simon, why don't you take us through what you suggest run plot armor as?
Okay, so I already gave my definition of plot armor earlier, so just go back to the beginning of the video if you forgot. So just as a few bases, and I'll go a little bit on a tangent, but I hope I'll bring it to a point in the end. Alright, so the first thing that I want to talk about is story in general. Like, story in general is like A happens, then B happens, then C happens. And if you're worth your salt, then the elements have some sort of dramatic arc, hopefully. Now, if you would ask a person from ancient Greek, a tragedian, they would say something along the lines of, this happened because it was the fate of them, which would, if in our discussion, maybe imply a little bit of plot armor, possibly. A thinker from the Age of Enlightenment, 2,000 years later, would probably say this happened because of causality. C happened because of B, because of A. But obviously that is not entirely true. Life is a little bit more complicated than that, because there are other things at work kind of influencing the story that are outside of it. Now, my opinion here is that every storyteller makes a choice on what to include and what not to include. What is signal, what is noise. And at times, it can be really arbitrary, like, what's the difference between those two? Now, about my position on these things and how I got into the mindset that I am in right now. Computer games around the year 2000 were made in a certain way that very much resonated with me. And I didn't stopped playing them because I wanted to win, but more because I really and genuinely enjoyed the medium of computer games. Now, if I would seek out the culprits for this, I would name 3 specific games, which was Vampire the Masquerade, Baldur's Gate, and Fallout. And in my opinion, they accomplished my fun with them mostly because of their thoughtful setting and their interactivity with those games, which in both kind of were conveyed through the choices and the consequences you had to deal with in those games. Now, I mentioned earlier in Guy's part that I want to go a little bit into choices and consequences and what I think about them, which in computer game terms, again, I would categorize them in 2 different types, type 1 and type 2. To start with type 2, because that's just how I roll, somewhere 10 years after I started computer gaming in 2010, it became more of a buzzword. It became like the marketing thing that you have to put on your RPG so it gets bought. And everyone adopted it. And to me, it became a hollow imitation of those things that came before in the game I mentioned earlier. The goal had changed. It had transmuted into replayability instead of what I'll go into in type 1. As an example, here's a Mass Effect 2 example, and there will be spoilers here, so mute me for about 15 or 20 seconds.
If you haven't played Mass Effect 2, which came out, almost 8 years ago, yes,
I've been shouted at for much less. So in Mass Effect 2, your companions had missions which were called loyalty missions, and they had nothing to do with the loyalty. They weren't about if they would betray you or whatnot. They were just, if you did them, there was some background. But primarily the gameplay impact was they wouldn't catch a stray bullet in the final mission. So you choose if they would die or not die. And there's no cause and effect here that you would be able to see. And that, for me, is the main property of this Type 2 choice and consequences. Now, the one that I do like, and that was there before, much more, is where the goal is not replayability, rather it is simulation. And this change fundamentally changes the application of what choices and consequences you lay out to the viewer, the consumer, the audience, because the choice and consequence is not a marketing gig. It is just the symptom of a mindset. And here again, as an example, Baldur's Gate 2, which is also a long time ago, but here also some spoilers, which is you had a lot of different companions you can choose from traveling with you, and they had a wide variety of different like backgrounds and opinions and values. And two of which, if you took them with you, one of which was Viconia, which is an evil drow priestess, and Keldon, a lawful good paladin, they didn't agree on much. And at some point in the game, after many arguments, Keldon was fed up. He had enough with Viconia's machinations and being like evil, so he attacked her. And now that's what you need to deal with. At the end, one of those two will be dead. You made the choice to keep them both in the party. You had many warnings and many opportunities to lose one of them, but you didn't adhere to the setting. You didn't adhere to the story that was presented to you, and that was the ultimate and inevitable, it seems, outcome of things. And that is, I think, the main property of the Type 1, which is it just reflects the setting of the characters, and its goal is simulation, so you can become engrossed in the story you consume. Now, at this point, you ask yourself, what does this have to do with plot armor? Right? So before I get to that, just one last thing to cover my back. I think when you tell a story, when you consume a story, you need to keep in mind the medium you use to consume it. For instance, movies right now, obviously, and TV are the big thing, like the most influential form of storytelling right now. And it is also the most limited to the consumer, because the storyteller, the director, the writer, the whatever, makes all the decisions. How it is shot, what is said, what the music is, the pacing, everything. So they have a lot of control over it. But PC games, which I talked about here now for quite an extensive amount of time, are very quickly growing and catching up with computer games, movies. And I think this is mostly because of the interactivity that it offers you. It offers you more of an immersive experience, because you can, depending on the game, interact in a completely different way, in your own pace, for instance, with this medium. At some point, however, there's a limit to what a computer game can accomplish, because the producers or the coders need to anticipate what you do and come up with a solution, and there's also obviously some sort of money involved. If you want to bring up everything, at some point it's not like economical anymore. And that is when I finally get to tabletop role-playing games. That is the one biggest advantage tabletop role-playing games have. It's the dungeon master, it's the game master, it's the storyteller, it's the however you want to call him. He has a mind that can react to your players. And not only him, but also the players, because of this back and forth, have the opportunity to tell a collaborative story and tell a believable story this way, which is not possible if you just watch a movie and you come across a problem. And I could give you an example from the new Star Wars movie, which absolutely, I stopped watching the movie. I went out of the cinema because of this. And there were actually two of these situations in the movie, which absolutely ruined my fun of it. But in a tabletop game, everybody can decide what the noise and what the signal is and incorporate it into the story. Now, if we start to interact with this and the Dungeon Master making decisions, perhaps on their own, then obviously the danger is that taking away. Now, why do I think plot armor, as I stated earlier, is bad? To me, role-playing games, the simulation of the setting is the goal. It's not the story. It isn't even the characters. It is the interaction from the characters with their environment. And if you free yourself from the grip of a 5-plot structure that has worked for thousands of years in a different medium, then you can surrender yourself to your setting and to what your players actually do and how they actually interact with it much better, in much more depth, I think. And then their interactions dictate the story, not you as a dungeon master. And instead of fighting these like player characters' decisions, then you can just react to your players, be the impartial adjudicator. Well, you don't even need to be impartial. You can be a benign adjudicator. You need to give your players an edge. Otherwise, they have no chance. But you don't need it to be on your own, from your own brain all the time. There are mechanical properties, for instance, in 5th edition, like advantage you can give your players, like inspiration you can give your players, that will help them, but only up to a point. There are other possibilities in the Dungeon Master's Guide which can give them fate points, which they could then use, but again, it's limited. And you need to know if you want to use it or not. But in the end, you must know that even if you start to fudge dice, or you help the villain, or you help the players, think through what this means to your setting, and as a consequence. Because you're building a card house for verisimilitude, and the more you just change things to make them fit your narrative, to have the player get out unscathed, the more of the foundation you chip away each and every time. And that is why I think plot armor is bad.
That's a very interesting position. Are you finished?
Well, I could. No, just like that's
no, I
that's
just
it
wasn't
for
sure.
now.
I was just listening to your discourse. It was fantastic. All right, so Mike, any thoughts and comments there? Simulation is king, if I can very roughly sum that up.
I would both respectfully agree and disagree with you, Simon.
No.
So basically, Guy is saying that the story is the most important thing, not so much the setting, not so much the monsters. It's the story, the overarching plot, the character sub arcs, and all of those kind of things are the most important thing. And it sounds like Simon is saying it's more about how the characters interact with the world, and in that. I was just listening to all the stuff that Simon was saying, especially toward the end, and I'm like going, that's plot armor. That's plot armor. That's plot armor. That's exactly what that is. Plot armor, I don't think, is limited to a character will not die. I think when Simon, when you mentioned that, the DMG has stuff for advantage or disadvantage, that's plot armor. You are, as the GM, if you are giving a player advantage or inspiration or whatever, you are giving them a way mechanically to make to give them an advantage or inspiration, but so that they're not going to be hurt, basically, is what you're doing. So that's plot armor.
Well, you could see it this way. My argument about it would be that adventurers are not your run-of-the-mill person necessarily, because then they would be an innkeeper.
Right.
So how you adjudicate this mechanically is absolutely up to any person, and I agree with you that, obviously I made a little bit of a hyperbole statement here, just to make a point, you will fall somewhere along the scale, but I agree that this could be seen as plot armor, yes.
So another question, I guess, that I would have for you, Simon, is if you were a new character, you were just starting a new campaign as a player, You go through the whole process of creating your character, going through a backstory, all that kind of stuff. You play through one session. The second session, you're at the top of a set of stairs and you trip and fall because of a bad dice roll, and your wizard that only has 6 hit points dies.
And he dies. Now,
I can understand that when he dies. I'm just saying that from most players' perspective is they don't want to die in a stupid way.
Right. So
falling off a horse. They don't want to die from falling off a damn horse.
Okay.
They want to die protecting the city from an orc horde. They want to die heroically. And I think that when you're talking about plot armor and even interacting with the setting, that I think it's our job as GMs to make everything as fun and as possible for everyone at the table. And dying in the middle of session 2 from falling off a horse is not fun.
That's a great point, and I actually can connect this to something Guy said earlier, that he didn't like the random number generator of a dice necessarily. Now, as a dungeon master, and this is, again, you could argue this is plot armor, but as a dungeon master, you have the foremost control of when you need to roll. Why would you need to roll to ride a horse? You're a hero. You can ride a horse. You don't need to roll to climb up a stairs or down a pair of stairs. So you need give the players the opportunity to slip or fall or whatever, right? So with that being said, I also come from 20 years of background in role-playing games. And in the early editions, especially in the early levels, it was a lot easier to die. So I personally, and obviously if you play as a dungeon master, you insert yourself into your players from the expectation point of view. I'm okay with my player characters dying, and that's something my players need to be okay with too. With all this being said, one thing that is very important, and Guy mentioned this earlier a little bit, you need to be on one page with your players. So you need to speak with your players and get them to understand what the game is about, what you're looking for, and so they won't have a bad awakening in the second day or second session to fall down a trap of stairs and then be shit, right? If they react this way, then there's an underlying problem with different expectancy.
Right. Well, I'm going to ask you a question, Simon, but it's not actually me asking this question. It's a comment from Twitter. Dungeons and Diabetes wrote in response. Would you let your players fail their finale? Is it acceptable to let the story end on a low note? And I mean that I think that really does sum it up for me as well. Is that something that you would be happy with?
Absolutely, I would absolutely be fine for the players to fail, even spectacularly, because they went in with the wrong mindset or whatever. The finale is supposed to be the crowning jewel and probably also the hardest fight. And even people who say, I want to tell a story, I want my players to experience this story, and that's why there is plot armor. I have this is actually something I feel a little bit more strongly about. I have little understanding if they would also make them win. Like, then, really just write a book. Right. If the outcome is foretold, write a book.
Right. No, absolutely. All right, Mike, do you want to give us your overview? Well, your thoughts on plot armor, so we can then.
Well, I'm going to have to look at my notes a little bit. Basically, like Guy said before, RPGs are basically collaborative stories, and I think that they're basically stories about some local bumpkins that end up saving the world and becoming powerful heroes. I mean, those are the tropes of RPGs. I think that it is very difficult for a young level 1 character who is just the son of a blacksmith. I think it's very difficult for them in the very beginning of a campaign to become a hero without a little bit of help. now and then. A little bit of help. I'm not saying that you give them this character shield, this plot armor, where they absolutely cannot die. But I would argue that plot armor is used in some way or fashion in every single game that we play. It can be used for the benefits of both the PCs and the villains, if necessary. And I would argue that the players have some kind of if they have some kind of plot armor, it doesn't necessarily lessen the fun of the game. If it's used correctly, I think it can actually enhance the fun that the players have at the table. So we've talked a lot about plot armor, and I would like to just give a few common uses of plot armor that you would see in a normal session. If the GM fudges a dice roll to miss on an attack roll that would otherwise kill a PC or an important NPC, I would view that as plot armor. A PC finds a magical item that would negate the special attacks of the big bad in the next room. They find boots of fire walking and they have to walk into a lava room, for example. The PCs are saved from certain death by a more powerful NPC, or a god intervenes, or, as Guy said, the parachuting dwarves that come in to save the PCs. The GM changes the attack from one PC to another that has a higher AC, more hit points, or both. Even though that may not be the most logical thing for that monster to do. The PCs have a villain cornered, but the villain somehow has a teleportation spell and escapes because, of course, they are a reoccurring villain in the story and it's not their time to die. The bad guys are getting routed too easily. The GM can send in reinforcements that are perhaps just a little bit stronger than the last group of goblins or orcs or whatever they were fighting. Like Simon mentioned, if they hand out inspiration or give advantage or disadvantage during the game, whether it's for good role play or whatever, you're basically negating a horrible roll, and that is plot armor. If the GM at any point nerfs or debuffs a villain to allow it to be more easily defeated by lowering its hit points, not using a particular powerful spell that it may have, or otherwise fighting in some kind of subpar manner, that's plot armor. Now, some of those types of examples, they don't sound too game breaking or decreasing any kind of fun in the game. To give you an example of this, my favorite superhero is Batman. I'm Batman. So if they came out with a new Batman movie, I would go to the movie knowing full well that Batman is not going to die in that movie, right? Batman has the coolest, badass black plot armor ever, right? So Batman is not going to die, but I will still go see it. I will still be entertained. I will still be engrossed in the story. And even though I am certain that Batman isn't going to die, like Simon mentioned earlier, if the writers, the directors, the special effects people, the actors, if they're all doing a good job, I should be on the edge of my seat thinking that this might be the end of Bruce Wayne. The same holds true for our stories. As GMs, we can give plot armor to the player characters and still have an amazing story to tell, like Guy wants to do. We can also make the story horrible if we do it wrong. Most plot armor is hidden from the players sitting at the table. So when we as GMs set up our encounters, the players don't know how many enemies they're going to have to fight. They don't know what kind of spells or weapons that the GM is going to throw at them. They don't know. most of the little adjustments, things that I mentioned before as examples of plot armor, the players may not ever know. So if the only time that I think plot armor really causes a major problem in a game is if the player knows that they have plot armor. And this is what I mentioned before. The player is either going to think that I'm an idiot, I did everything wrong, I need better armor, I suck at this, whatever, or they're going to take advantage of it. So basically, how do we as GMs keep plot armor from wrecking everything? I think we need to be flexible. I think we need to prioritize, and I think we need to improvise. We have to be flexible as to who, what, when, where, and how we use plot armor. You don't give plot armor to the red shirts on the away team, but they don't have to be killed every time either. I think that most GMs give their PCs plot armor for the first few sessions without batting an eye. And this goes back to the whole, Bob fell off a horse and died kind of thing. It's just not a fun way to die. I don't think that, they need to be killed in such a simple, meaningless way, if that makes sense. Like I said before, I think they want to die doing something so heroic and, some kind of self-sacrifice where they're saving the city, the town, the world, whatever. I think that is an epic way of dying. Not saying that the PCs can't die. I'm just saying it should be in an epic, heroic kind of way. We have to prioritize the plot armor. Is plot armor primarily used to avoid death? I would say you could use plot armor for other things as well. But where is your limit? Where is your priority as a GM as to how much plot armor is going to be given? Sure, they're not dead, but maybe they've come down with lycanthropy. Maybe they lose a limb. Will the big bad evil guy kill one of their family members or a loved NPC of the party? Life and death encounters can still build tension and test our heroes and drive the story forward, but it doesn't have to be the PCs themselves. Going back to the whole Batman thing, in one of the movies, Rachel gets kidnapped by Two-Face, and Batman has to make this very tense moral choice between saving Rachel from blowing up or saving the whole city of Gotham. So you can still build all this kind of tension and amazing story, even though Batman's not going to die. Spoiler. I guess I should have said that beforehand. But anyway, I think that it's great from a story standpoint, like Guy wants to do, to use a villain in a way that provides psychological warfare against the PCs. He can't kill them, but they're going to hurt. They're going to hurt a lot, right? So it's these kinds of moral choices and obstacles that I think makes our game fun, even when you're including some kind of plot armor in the game. The final thing is improvisation. When using plot armor, this is a really good skill, I think, for all GMs to learn, is how to improvise better. And like Guy had talked about before, like I have talked about on my channel, if you are prepared and you think about things ahead of time, you think about the why, you think about the possible things that your players could do, you will be better improvising at the table with whatever they throw at you. So in one of Guy's videos, he talked about PCs not planning and not preparing and going and attacking an orc camp. in Guy's world, if he has already said that orcs don't take prisoners, they're just going to kill anybody. But if Guy doesn't want to kill them all and have a complete TPK because they're stupid, he wants to give them a chance. And maybe that's part of the whole story is, an escape kind of thing, is maybe when the encounter that Guy actually wants to run. So if the PCs attack this orc camp and they're taken prisoner instead of being killed, as a GM, we need to think about how do we adjust and adapt our world and our rules that we have already laid down to aid the party, to give them plot armor. And I actually wrote down, as the GM, you can knock out the PCs and take them prisoner, and now they can potentially escape. But orcs don't do that. We've already told them orcs don't do that. So now you need to improvise. Perhaps the orc champion of this tribe is smitten with one of the party members and wants to marry her. And he thinks that killing all the rest of the party will just kind of dampen the whole honeymoon kind of deal, right? So that's one way that you could get around that orcs don't kill or take prisoners. Perhaps the orcs were hunting the PCs and there was a large bounty on their heads for bringing them back alive. That would be a reason why the orcs didn't kill them. Or maybe there wasn't a reason why, and now the decision of those orcs, or the main orc, to take prisoners is now causing strife within the tribe. Grognar took prisoners. He's unfit to lead the Red Death tribe, right? So now you have inner strife amongst the orcs, and that may be another easy way for the PCs to actually escape. So basically, I agree with Guy that story is very important. I also agree with Simon that what helps drive that story is the PC's interactions with their setting, their world, their NPCs, and all of that kind of stuff. And I don't think that plot armor is necessarily a bad thing. I think when it is overt, and if you have players that would try to take advantage of it, that's when you just have to kill the PC.
End it here right now.
Just kill the PC.
Yeah. Oh, you can't die? Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
Watch this.
Right. Absolutely. So, Simon, questions for Mike?
Yeah. So the first question you said is basically coming down to the monomyth, right? Like you say, the Joe Schmo saving the world. How does this happen if there's no advantage for the character at some times? And this is absolutely true. And I think this really depends on how you approach this topic. In my experience, many of these stories very early on give them the character, the possible hero, an advantage in the sense of they find something interesting. In Aragon, he gets a dragon and he gets a teacher. Like they can find magic items that help them lift them above the rest. They can get maybe allies that can help them. Which now we are in a situation where it's not as much of a plot armor, and you can argue it's a plot armor, but it is already within the setting. And then what I meant earlier, like if you help your players, now it's some sort of makes much more sense within the setting because it was already established. You had this ace up your sleeve, and you also, and if you use this, and that's why I think just the carte blanche is the big problem. If you use these circumstances, then there's also a limit. I like to have limitations, and I like my players to know their limitations on how much help they will get, because then the players and the characters they play would plan accordingly, hopefully.
Right. And
So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No. So I think Yeah, Mike, as usual, you always bring a balance, which I kind of like. As you say, it's
I'm the
about
chosen one.
right? Yes.
That's blood armor.
And I think that from listening to what you're saying, is plot armor is going to happen one way or another. Whether it's a mechanical advantage that the rulebook allows us to take advantage of, whether it's a narrative imperative, the bottom line is it comes down to the quality of one's players, I think. Insofar as having that introspection, that ability to move back and say, hang on, let's not attack that orc camp, because remember, so-and-so said that the orcs don't ever take prisoners. If one's players are astute enough to remember that and then to come up with a much better plan on how to approach the orc village, I think that's fantastic. I was sitting there, and as you were saying it, Simon was going, no, they just die. They die. They get executed. They die. I told them they shouldn't go in there. They went in there. They die. Right? And I'm sitting there going, yeah, oh God, I've got to come up with a reason why they don't now.
Okay, so I would just, they die. If they do it this way, they die, yes. But the one thing that you need to remember as a Dungeon Master, if you want to play like I proclaimed it here, I would say make sure that your players know what the characters would know in session, like in setting, because oftentimes your players have knowledge that the characters don't have, but this works the other way around just as well. Maybe they just forgot that they eat you if they kill you.
Right.
Then you should remind them, because that is something they would have on their minds as characters.
Correct. I think that's also a very big contributing factor here to plot armor, is what the players know, what the characters know. There is a discontinuity there between the player is not the one who's standing looking at this giant orc fortress. The player is sitting in a nice, comfortable environment, rolling dice, pretending to be standing in front of a giant orc fortress. And I mean, you just have to look at your own experiences in real life. The other day I went to the Sky Tree, which is this giant, it's the tallest freestanding tower in the world. It's 600 meters high. And I had genuine fear about going inside. I hate elevators. In this elevator, you go and just it's 600 meters above the ground. Anyway, that was a very different fear than I would have had if I was sitting in the lounge and my character walks up to this really tall tower. Okay, cool. What do I have to roll to get inside of it? Well, nothing, right? So yes, there's that big disconnect.
So here's a question then that kind of plays with that thought. You say even Batman has problems, even though he has plot armor, because of the psychological warfare. Now, what I found, I tried this. I ran like a Underdark game 2 years back or so, and what I tried to do, make it really like fucked up, and I found that doing this over the internet made it even more problematic, but I did this also in home games. I found that players have really a problem to immerse themselves in the game in general, and you need to help them as much as you can. That's one of the reasons why I say that the card house, right? Now, how do you do psychological warfare if they just say, yeah, well, she dies, but what about my +1 sword?
Right, absolutely. I do think that's a very different video, and if you want to see the three of us debating on that one, please leave your comment below. All right,
we'll be back next week.
Yes, where I will also wear a blue shirt, so that way I can fit in. I didn't get the memo, apparently. Anyway, so all right. I think everyone's had an opportunity to present their case. Mike, I think because you kind of lean towards the middle area, there are not too many questions from our sides on that. Your thoughts as the viewer at home, there's many ways of handling it. Here are just 3 ways in which we do it. I know I have to reassess very critically, and I think we can all 3 agree that it boils down to the quality or the social contract that your players accept. If you've got players who want to get immersive and they want to keep track of their weight allowance and how many arrows they have and they want the grit, then perhaps I agree. I think Simon, then a much more simulative space will allow them to flourish and allow them to have fun. Whereas if you've got players who want to be Batman, who want to be the hero, and
I'm Batman.
They should totally be Spider-Man because he's way cooler. But if they want to be Batman, that's fine. But the point is, then they should be allowed to play in a space that allows that to happen, where they can do crazy things and not suffer necessarily from too much hindrance of those rules. Anyway, that's my thoughts. I think that sums it up, right? Is that it's really about the players and the GM trying to get that mesh right.
Yeah,
and
as long as everybody's having fun, that's the most important thing. As long as everybody's having fun, go with it.
That's it. And I also think that there's a certain amount of discussion that has to happen beforehand. We talk about session 0. I think everybody talks about session 0. Mike, on your channel, you've got a whole video on session 0. I think it's important for that to be one of the things is, hey guys, do we want realistic or do we want simulistic, or do we want narrative? Do we want a bit of a mixture of both where and I think that's an important discussion to have. Anyway, before we sign off, Mike, you run a YouTube channel. Wouldn't you just tell everybody about it? It's a wonderful channel. If you haven't discovered it, he's about to tell you how to do so.
On YouTube, I run a channel called Game Masters Vault. So you can certainly check out some of the videos that we have. We do a lot of GM tips on things like session 0 and when to ask for dice rolls and all kinds of different stuff. Also on Twitter at GM's Vault. So you can find me on Twitter, and also on Facebook. If you just do a search for Game Masters Vault, I'm on Facebook as well.
And I'll try and bring those links up. Simon, you do not have a YouTube channel, even though I maintain that you should have one. But anyway, there we are. So I will just take this moment to thank both Simon and to Mike for joining me today on this video. Thank you for watching. Yes, Simon, you made this whole thing happen. You kept prodding me, saying, let's do the video, let's do the video, let's do the video. So you have him to blame for this week's video. But until next time.
If you want more of those, I can prod him more.
Right, not sure how to take that one, but anyway, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, hit that subscribe button. If you want to join the ranks of Great Game Master, head on over to Mike's channel. It's got some wonderful stuff there. And until next time, I wish you and your players the very happiest, safest plot armor that you can possibly get away with without them noticing.